Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Aaron, for all the prep work that you've done to set us off. I'm delighted to be here. I've always learned that if you give a dinner party, you never, ever apologize for the food ahead of time. You know that you burnt something, you scraped it off, and you were going to serve it anyway, or you put in vinegar when you meant to put in red wine in the bourguignon. But I'm going to do that. I'm going to apologize for the quality of my pictures. Because, as you will see, they no longer exist, and we're working off black and white photographs. And thank you very much, Heritage, for figuring out a way to turn the lights down, because I thought that would be important to at least getting the most out of what we've got. So, and I was going to actually show you this because I wanted you to at least have some delicious Cassatt images to look at. And these, you will see, are part of my topic, although I will not return to them because this is a painting and a print, but they were both done in preparation for what, in fact, we're going to talk about today. And that is this. In early 1893, the expatriate American artist Mary Cassatt, who of course lived in Paris, she shipped this painting, the biggest painting she had ever made, to Chicago to be installed high in the Gallery of Honor, that is the big lobby space of the Women's Building at the World's Columbian Exposition. 54 feet long, 14 feet high. And to make that work, she was then in her late 40s, Cassatt had gone to the expense of building a glass studio behind her country house outside of Paris. And this glass house, this was not unprecedented, but it was unprecedented for an impressionist. She had dug a trench, and she could lower the painting up and down, so she didn't have to go up and down ladders. She could just stay earthbound, but she could paint the upper reaches of this canvas. Now, what was, just to remind you, the Columbian Exposition? It was a major fair in Chicago, an announcement that they had grown back and come back after a big major city fire. It was a Beaux-Arts white set of buildings. That was the official style, was a Beaux-Arts style. And in it, there was a very special building called the Woman's Building, which you see here in two different versions. Painted version and a black and white. Now, the Woman's Building, as you can see better, I'm supposed to be able to use this thing, but I don't know. Let's see. Can you see? There's the Ferris wheel. Did I touch it? No. Let's try this. No, let's go back. I'm used to this kind of a pointer, you know? Not this kind of a pointer. Laser pointer. All right, let's try that. Ferris wheel? No? Yeah? Okay. That is the first Ferris wheel ever erected, I am told. And it was part of what they called the entertainment zone, the Midway. And George Ferris had done it. And so the Women's Building was sort of announced the Midway. This is often made much of, that it was sort of on the periphery of the official buildings, but at the beginning of the entertainment zone. There had been a small women's building at the 1876 Centennial Fair in Philadelphia. So this was not the first, but it was by far the biggest ever erected. There were a few more in later fairs, all combined together to tell a kind of suffrage story. If you read just the women's building history, you'd see how it goes hand in glove with women's politics in the late 19th and early 20th century. But this was the largest of all. Now, what was a women's building? Well, briefly put, it was an exhibition hall dedicated to showing off women, their art, their inventions, their contributions to industry, and their diverse charitable causes. It was compensatory. Why? Because women were not allowed to participate in the other big exposition halls given over to agriculture, electricity, machinery, and so on, transportation, and so on. So it was a clearly political kind of motive that the fairer sex had to have a presence in what was a male-dominated fair. And inevitably, women's building then was steeped, even if you were middle of the road or conservative, it was inevitably steeped in the gender politics of the, and particularly around women's rights, of the late 19th century. It expressed what Frances Willard's a suffragist and somebody very active in the making of the building, said, and this is her quote, "The greatest discovery of the 19th century is that women have discovered women." Now, you're going to see these black and white pictures as we go forward. As was common with fairs, the buildings are always temporary in construction. They come down after their 9 months or so. But in this case, we know that, and let's see what I've got coming up next, not the building, inside of the building, but we do know that there was so much excitement about the women's building that at some point the large paintings that were commissioned for it, the decorations, were rolled up and put into a warehouse. But we don't know what happened next. All we know is that they are lost for eternity. Lots of people have searched for them. There's an article in your bibliography about that search. Probably the warehouse burned down at some point. Now, as soon as the fair was conceived, a number of women's groups stepped up saying, we have to have a women's building, based on what they had learned in '76, which is that you could have a presence. It was very small in their mind, and it had been run much too much by men. Suffragists came together saying, let's call ourselves the Isabella Association. This is a fair name for Christopher Columbus. So they're naming themselves after the Queen that sent Christopher Columbus to the States, calling themselves the Isabellas. And they argued, no women's building. We want equal representation of men and women in all the exhibition pavilions. And if we have a separate building, it's where we do programming about women's causes. They opposed a separate building because it ghettoized women. Is this sounding a little familiar with other politics that you have heard in the 20th century? But their petition was far too radical to sell. The women who got permission, like the ones you see photographically on the screen, included a few suffragists, but by and large, they were a middle-of-the-road group dedicated to expanding women's sphere of influence in American life, but not exclusively focused on issues of equality. The majority of them were middle and upper class, white women who did charitable volunteer work as members of same-sex ladies' clubs and women's auxiliaries. They supported temperance, protective legislation for working-class women. Some had started settlement houses, others led the kindergarten movement, or established colleges for women, or set up fine arts associations in their communities to support the beginning of museum culture in this country that was emerging everywhere. Historians have come up with names of these women who were stepping into public life as club women, and they're called sometimes club women, or a nicer term, though probably invented by an academic, social housekeepers. The latter term because so many women focused on domestic issues. In my work, I also characterize them as post-Victorians. And let me tell you what I mean by that is that they're women born to Victorian mothers, and families, and protocols of domesticity and femininity, but as they matured, they began to push against what they deemed restrictive boundaries and step out of the home and become volunteers in civic life. They were on the threshold, in other words, of becoming something else, like the new woman or the modern woman. Those were phrases that were being used by 1900 and 1910. But they weren't there quite yet. The male organizers of the fair, under broad cultural pressures to allow for a women's building, called the women who gave their time to administering it was voluntary, the lady managers. And that's whom you see the core group there. The men also set down rules about participation. They allowed for 2 representatives from every women, of course, every state and territory, and a few extras from Chicago. 117 of them there were, lady managers, and they elected the socially well-placed Bertha Palmer of Chicago, a 41-year-old mother of 2, to be their president. Bertha and her husband, Potter Palmer, had just built a new mansion. It was really a big mansion. The Castle, it was called, on the new Lakeshore Drive that Palmer was developing as an upscale real estate project. The couple were also Francophiles, forming an art collection of French art that eventually they donated to the Art Institute in Chicago. Mrs. Palmer's primary charitable causes had been basically caring for poor women and immigrant populations, and she was a member of several clubs, but she had never, in fact, held an elective office in one of her clubs. And she proved to be an inspired administrator who charted out a centrist position between left and right, so to speak, trying to accommodate all. She made sure that the exhibits, and I'm just giving you 4 little looks here, came from every field. There was an inventions room, which is what you see in the upper left. Those are women standing behind things they have invented, and you can see that they're all home objects, they're patents. A modern kitchen, upper right, ethnographic displays of American Indian, Eskimo, Polynesian, and African women. The building also included spaces for fine arts. There was a library of literature written by women, an auditorium for congresses and lectures, and of course a tea room or two. It was always, in fact, touted as a good place for an afternoon stop, as a place to rest your fair legs. And there was also plenty of examples of women's handwork, embroidery, lace, and other forms of needlework. If you really wanted to go after the women's building as not being upscale enough, you went after the amount of handiwork that was in the displays. When women from the fishing industry complained that men had taken away what they were supposed to have in the fisheries building, Mrs. Palmer, and this is what you have here, hung their nets and their tools in her office, a ladies' parlor, which was a ladies' parlor at ground level. Mrs. Palmer, given her interest in the fine arts, insisted there be a competition to hire a female architect to design the building, and long story there, but Sophie Hayden, a recent MIT grad, got the bid. There was also a competition for a woman sculptor to do the official sculptures of the exterior of the building. She wanted it to look just like the other large Beaux-Arts buildings. And she was able to get modest fees. Miss Hayden, for instance, got $1,000 for her design, whereas the male architects of other buildings got $10,000 for each of their buildings. She understood that every building had a famous name attached to it, one of them, in fact, the young Louis Sullivan, and that there was also an official corps of sculptors, male sculptors and painters, who had received paid commissions to decorate all the other official fair buildings. And they had a manager, Frank Millet, and a coordinator, and they also, the men had spaces, workspaces at the fair in which to make their pieces. Women, just to make a point, because this will come up later, they had no leader, so to speak, calling the shots, no funds, and no designated space. They had to do everything in their own studios, and thus the trench that Mary Cassatt did for hers. Palmer, however, made the invitations. Now, here's what you're seeing. Let me just, before I move on. Here, what you're seeing is the Gallery of Honor. I'm not going to try to use this pointer because we'll spend too much time doing it. Maybe I'll just point with my hand, but that kind of disadvantages you guys. But you see the tympana, they were called, or tympanum for singular, and those were the large murals. One by Cassatt is the one on the far left. The one by Mary McMonnies, we'll get to in a second, is on the right. And then there were also official designated commissions for these large paintings. We won't be looking at those today. There was display of fine arts and display of all kinds of works on papers and so on in all these cases that you have here. And then you have off both floors other galleries given over to those rooms, like the rooms that we were just looking at. Mrs. Palmer was able to secure $3,000 to give each of the 2 tympana painters, and the men were getting $7,000 for the comparable work in other buildings. She couldn't get anything for these smaller decorations, but she got young women artists to volunteer their time and hopefully get some prestige from being shown in the building. Now, when I began to look anew at the decorations, and that was a long time ago, I've written a book about the women's building, what really caught my eye is that this was public art made by female artists who customarily had no chance to make anything other than an easel painting or table-sized sculpture. They never worked on this scale because they never were asked to or even allowed to, it being assumed that women were too frail for the physical rigors of working on ladders or scaffolding. The one exception to that is Rosa Bonheur in France, who did do some big, large works. So when women said yes to doing these decorations, it was an extraordinary opportunity for them. It was very prestigious, and as far as most of them were concerned, it was a once in a lifetime. Secondly, since public art was often mural scaled, you had to work at a larger scale than you were ever accustomed to doing, and you also had to take on themes of uplift and inspiration. Murals were not meant to just be pretty frou-frous, but they were supposed to somehow inspire and stimulate you. And I wanted to understand how women would use this unique opportunity, having very little instruction and almost no coordination between them. Mrs. Palmer gave them one kind of direction. All she told them was, I want a history of women showing their progress across the ages. Progress. Here's a direct quote, the footsteps of women will be traced from prehistoric times, that's Mrs. McMoney's job, and her mural was called Primitive Women, using the lingo of the day. The footsteps will be traced from prehistoric times to the present. And then she gave just a little more detail. She wanted women shown in their primitive condition as bearers of burdens and doing drudgery. And then as a contrast, what women could do today. So back then and now, basically. It's what we came to call in the 1970s a her story rather than a his story. And her theme, progress of women, was in keeping with the central theme of the fair, which was the 400 years of progress in America since Columbus discovered the land. Male artists had a vocabulary for progress narratives. If we had time, we could look at a whole bunch of 19th century progress narratives. It was a common bit of iconography, and it had been for nearly half a century. Typically, men would show, for instance, the progress of male would be through a technology or through some kind of inventions like transportation. So you'd start with the invention of the wheel, the coming of the wagon and the carriage, and then you'd end with steamships and trains. Or the conquering of fire when it's wild and burning things down to make it productive for the industrial age. But what if you're asked to paint the progress of women? What would it look like? There were few written histories of women at the time, and no, as far as I'm concerned, I have not been able to find any visual histories. So my second reason to think about these was to decipher what women would invent when asked to do a progress mural. So for the rest of my time, I'm going to look at the iconography and show you what women formulated, which I believe to be the first visual history of women in the Western world. Not surprisingly, the history they told was one in which women increasingly get better deals, better options, and increasingly liberated from the bondages of the past. Now, just to underline what I've said earlier, they don't talk with one another, unfortunately, because Mrs. Palmer didn't put anything together so that they could actually get together. But it's very interesting that in these two murals, and let me show you them now, here, McMoney's is on the top, Primitive Women, Modern Women on the bottom by Cassatt. Both of them divided, so to speak, the canvas into three different scenes, a big central scene and a left and a right. McMoney's used over life-size figures and spaced them rather equally across the canvas with, in the background, stylized trees that kind of pull the whole thing together. Cassatt, and this proved to be hard on people who were trying to understand what she was doing, she used smaller figures, and she painted a thick border around, a decorative border, like a tapestry, she said, around her three very distinct settings. And then she put roundels with little children in them. The only babies are in these little roundels in the border. Mary McMoney's was a younger artist. She was about 33 or so, early 30s, and she was comfortable with ladders. And she also had two advantages. Mrs. Palmer had to find people that could actually take on and would be willing to take on challenge of works of this scale. The first person she asked was Elizabeth Gardner, who was an American in Paris who studied with Bouguereau and later became Mrs. Bouguereau. And Mrs. Gardner, Miss Gardner, who became Mrs. Bouguereau, did just the predictable. She said, "Oh, I couldn't possibly do that. I can't. My constitution wouldn't be up to it." Well, Mary McMonnies had the advantage that her husband, Frederick McMonnies, was a lead sculptor at the fair, and he had rented a large building, an industrial building of some sort in Paris in which to work, and he could provide her with a space where she could stretch the canvas, as you will see her doing here, and then paint it using a movable ladder. The other advantage, I suppose we can call it, or circumstance, about Mary McMonnies is that she knew Puvis de Chavannes, and she actually, it's said, had Puvis come by and critique her mural, an example of which, for a mural you see on the lower side here. And he was the most popular French muralist of the day, and she took his style to be her inspiration, placing lightly clad, lean and idealized women in some long ago Arcadian past, just as he does in his painting. But where she parted from Puvis, and these are important adjustments, this is where her invention comes in, is that her women are Amazonian in physique, and they do all the work. In Puvis, sensuous women loll about in the sunshine. In McMonnies' mural, women from long ago do all the labor. On the left side, and we'll quickly just run through these. So on the left side, and it's the left corner that you're looking at there, women plow the land with oxen and plant seed. And one exhausted woman, is on her knee there, kneels to take water from a jug offered to her by a younger woman. On the right side of the mural, women tend to a man. Very rare to have a man in any of the works commissioned for the women's building. But in this case, she is giving him water, and as the guidebook put it, she's relieving him of his game. She's crushing grapes into a cup to, quote unquote, refresh the tawny giant. And a young boy mimicking the father figure that he's going to become is tucked into the corner. The only other men in this mural there are a couple of men on hunters on horseback. So in other words, women, and I guess we should look at the middle one just to fill this out, where women are carrying water and raising children. You have a very strong Madonna-like mother and child image. But what she's really giving us here, and there was literary precedence for this, is a kind of agricultural matriarchy, where women do everything for survival except hunt for food. That's what men do. And these are days of very hard labor. Now, this is primitive women, so if we turn then from primitive to modern women, it's another set of women in activities. 18 women in this mural by Cassatt, and all of them now are bathed in sunshine and light. We know that, and I'll mention this a little bit later on, but this is all about blues and greens, pinks, and some reds. It's a very bright mural, and this bothers people, as we will see. So this is the progress part. At first glance, you might say, oh, these are 3 scenes typical of an impressionist. Children and ducks running on the left, women picking fruit in the center, women making music on the right. Interestingly, no mother and children, which you think of so much as her trademark imaging. Her figures wear contemporary dress, and they're in action, yet they appear to be almost like a tableau vivant, holding their poses, giving each scene a ceremonial quality, which I think is important to note. For what was challenging to Cassatt was, how do you invent 3 scenes that stays true to the naturalism she was espousing as a progressive impressionist painter, but also do what murals are supposed to do, speak inspirationally about ideals and ideas. In other words, she had to adjust her easel painting realist vocabulary and speak of something bigger. She named them like this in a letter to Mrs. Palmer: young girls pursuing fame, left. Modern women practicing the arts, right. And in the middle, young women plucking the fruits of knowledge and science. In other words, she's trying to put her realism in service to ideas. And so she's giving them, she's not saying orchard picking or apple picking and the like. I might just say as a side note that Degas and she had a huge fight over this mural because he thought no decent impressionist would ever do a mural painting, particularly because you'd have to adjust it to speak to something bigger than everyday life. And he tried to discourage her from taking what she saw as the challenge of a lifetime kind of thing. So they had a falling out over this, although I think they finally got back together again a little bit. Now, what's so interesting, and I'll take you first to the one on the left, is this one that she calls Young Girls Pursuing Fame. It's a wild idea. If you look at it closely, the three girls, and they're young girls, are running after, what are they running after? It looks like a kite, probably from where you're sitting. But if you squint and look really closely, it's a little tiny nude girl figure with a swatch of black hair flowing down her back, and she's blowing a trumpet. She is Fame. Fame is always, got a trumpet in her hand. She looks, however, realist. So she looks more like a Cupid doll than a winged goddess. And she represents what the French actually called at the time. They had a word for this kind of movement of realists into allegory, and she called them realist. They called this kind of thing allegorie réelle, a fusion of realism and allegory. We also know, and this is so interesting when you think of the kind of research Cassatt did in order to set up her vocabulary, that she used a very reputable source for her scene, a fresco from Pompeii, where the girls chase after love, and that's Cupid in the case of her source. It's still strange, however, that a staunch realist like Cassatt would resort to allegory, a pictorial vocabulary that she and her fellow impressionists firmly rejected as untruthful and outdated. It also could be seen as a failure of imagination on her part, a lapse into conventional thinking. But another way to think about it is that the only way Cassatt could imagine expressing what was at the time a very radical idea that women like herself should desire to be famous. By articulating this idea through allegory, Cassatt was stating her ideal somewhat ambiguously or indirectly. Her lack of clarity may have been that she couldn't figure out any other way to do it. One might read the idea of fame in her mural as an ideal for contemporary young girls, the younger generation, and nothing more than a youthful folly. I don't think that was what was on her mind, because I think it's rather an effort to really express the inexpressible at that moment, and it's a raw and rare moment of autobiographical candor. We know from letters that Cassatt expressed her ambitions to be famous at an early age and never lost her desire for notice. But her mother, for instance, that's the Victorian part of her post-Victorianism, her mother never approved. Writing a family member, mother, of course, wanted grandchildren rather than more paintings. So she writes, "Mother is at work again, intent on fame and money, and counts on her fellow countrymen now that she has made a reputation here, Paris. After all, a woman who's not married is lucky if she has a decided love for work of any type, and the more absorbing, the better." Now, on the right side, what she called modern women practicing the arts, you see an empty landscape, one woman dancing, one playing a banjo, and one singing. Unlike other decorations by women artists, Cassatt did not choose to show women practicing fine arts in a traditional way, such as having a palette in their hands, for instance, and standing at an easel. But she rather, and this is fun to see, she chose women practicing what you might call, the everyday fine arts, the everyday arts. One playing a banjo, which was in fashion at the time, for women in particular, and another performing a dance. The banjo was very popular among young women, as you can see a banjo sort of team here. There's plenty of examples of photographs of women with banjos, and you saw also an example in a print earlier on. But the art form that really set people wagging was the one represented by the figure holding her skirt up high. Viewers knew what this was. It was a new form of rhythmic dance called skirt dancing, associated with a new generation of young women going to college and beginning to use their bodies in public exercise, but also as a form of dance. You could see skirt dancing in cabaret and nightclubs, or you could see Loie Fuller doing it, an American dancer, as you see in this photograph here. Performed in loose, long, and accordion-shaped skirts, skirt dancing upset people because it was deemed risque, suitable for performance in low-life dance halls, but like the desire for fame, not becoming in well-bred girls. And Cassatt was criticized for choosing it. In the center, the large image, you have a scene of fruit picking. And this was another very inventive way of doing this kind of iconography. She was making her realism speak to women's aspirations for parity with men, particularly in their quest for equal opportunity in higher education. Cassatt called this section Young Women Plucking the Fruits of Knowledge and Science. Fruits in this case was not sustenance, food, nor was it hard labor. Fruit signified knowledge, as it did for Adam and Eve in the biblical Garden of Eden. Not sexual knowledge in this case, but learning and education. Cassatt's orchard scene is about young women going to school. No mothers and children are in this scene. It's just young women sharing the fruits of knowledge with yet younger women. It's an all-female Garden of Eden. You might think of it as a girls' school or an academy of learning. The girls do not wear mortar boards, as they might if you were a more traditional artist. You would, to signify a woman as scholar, she would often wear a mortar board and a black cape, as academics, students did at the time. But nevertheless, this is a realist, again, rendition of a bigger idea. One need only compare, for instance, one of Pissarro's fruit picking scenes, he did many, to see how Cassatt took a popular Impressionist theme and elevated it into a story about the strivings of young modern women. She made it into an allegory. In the Pissarro, men and women are in country dress. Their bent-over bodies spell out the labor of picking. His depiction's about real work, real rural work. Cassatt's women, on the other hand, are in summer dress, representing not their work clothes, but their modernity. They're not peasants. They're middle-class white females, and they do not strain, but take almost balletic poses as older girls handing fruit to younger ones. Fruit picking, and I'm showing you here one of the many, she did a fruit picking scenes that she did as she was getting ready to do this mural. She also very nicely put out some beautiful prints and paintings like the one I showed you at the beginning to prep herself and sort of learn her themes and see how it was going to go in the final version. Fruit picking was not just a metaphor for seeking education and knowledge in the late 19th century. It was also used to signify female sexuality and childbearing. I'm not sure, I had fun kind of working on this bit of the iconography because it was so odd and strange to me to find examples like this Valentine on the right and a piece from a panorama on the left. I'm not sure when it occurred, but sometime in the 19th century, women in fruit picking took a life of its own, encoding references to female anatomy, birthing, and mothering. The most explicit depiction I've found of this cultural coding is this panorama where one Victorian woman shakes babies out of a tree into the skirts of another. The long skirt held out from the receiver's body is a metaphoric womb. She who holds up her skirts gets the baby. Another version I've located of this trope is this Valentine on the other side, where the baby's being plucked from the tree and then bathed in a fountain. Some of the gestures Cassatt gave her prenuptial women in the center of her mural seem to be referencing fertility in similar ways. And I'm showing you, this is the one color, it's not a color photograph, they didn't exist in 1893, but this is a color version that somebody made for a magazine illustration. So it's the one bit of evidence we have of what the colors were like, and somebody has tried to fit that color, making it even stronger in color, into the middle version, the central scene of the mural. So if you look, for instance, and here again, you have to look at the little girl who's being handed fruit from the woman on the ladder. And she has, if you look closely, she places her right hand with a piece of fruit on her stomach. And then there's an older girl holding a basket of cherries, often with sexual connotations in art, so that it merges with her body and exposes, as it were, the uterine shape of the lower female anatomy. So now that we've read and decoded the decorations, let me underline how impressively creative MacMonnies and Cassatt were in coming up with a progress narrative for which there were no visual precedents. Neither of them put women on a pedestal or made her into a goddess. Their women were all physically active and without men in control of their destiny. MacMonnies envisioned a pre-modern agricultural matriarchy, Cassatt a modern era in which she advocated for women artists, educated women, and most daring of all, the right of women to seek fame. Her message was entirely in keeping with other imagery in the building. And here is the guidebook to the fair, the women's building at the fair. And you can see it's a woman with a palette, and she's surrounded by the arts. There's something there that represents sculpture, there's tapestry, there's spinning, there's ceramics, and then her foot is on books to represent education. So we've rehearsed all these ideas in the Cassatt, but they're put entirely in a different kind of vocabulary, although what they have in common is a woman in modern-day dress, not a goddess, who is representing each of these art forms. So lastly, how were the murals received? Well, I have to say they were very controversial. Let's go back to them. Not so much because of the stories. There was some pushback about the fact that there were only a few men and no men at all in the Cassatt. So there's some commentary about how can you have life without men kind of thing. But what drew the commentary, what people spent the most time doing was being either critics, official critics or amateur critics, male and female. And what they really didn't like was the lack of unity of style between the MacMonnies down here and the Cassatt murals. They looked to see how scale worked. They were looking for harmony of color, a color scheme, and they were looking to see that they had, in fact, somehow put together a symbiotic set of murals. And MacMonnies wins the prize for being readable from the ground, so to speak, because her figures were large, they were far more legible, and people liked the fact that she has a run of continuous trees at the back, which kind of pulled and unified the three-part story. And also, and this, of course, we can't tell from a black and white, but she had soft colors. So everybody liked, this was a very white building. All the buildings at the fair were mostly white buildings. And they would use terms like graceful, picturesque, sober, gentle to describe her work. Cassatt's, however, her style took a beating, as well as the fact that her figures were too small to read, the fact that the mural was broken up into three parts, that it lacked the conventional unity, and that, in fact, and this was the most prominent criticism, her palette was too loud. Her colors simply stood out. And so instead of adjectives like gentle and picturesque, you get aggressive, unladylike, and even cynical and sarcastic. And I'll just show you the color again. So I'll leave you with one last quote, which is by just of this sort. There are many, if you look in my book, I have many versions of this statement, but this is a good tight one by a critic called Henry Fuller. He says, the impudent greens and brutal blues of Miss Cassatt seem to indicate an aggressive personality with which compromise and cooperation would be impossible. She works with the men in Paris on their own ground. We know that Cassatt was furious about the critiques and the way the murals were received. And we also know she didn't come to see her mural in situ at the fair, and it's not clear whether possibly the criticism had something that repelled her and kept her at home. She also got seasick, so there's various reasons she might not want to come back to the country at that point. But here's a wonderful quote that she writes to Sarah Tyson Holloway, who had been a counselor and a mentor to Mrs. Palmer in finding artists for these official commissions. She says, "Give me France. Women do not have to fight for recognition here if they do serious work. I suppose it's Mrs. Palmer's French blood which gives her organizing powers and her determination that women should be someone and not something." Seen from today's perspective, a much later perspective, we can see that Cassatt was rewriting the rules of decoration. She was decisively breaking with the Beaux-Arts aesthetic and looking ahead to an artist like Henri Matisse or Solowit, or may he rest in peace, Frank Stella. We know what those murals are. If we had more time, we could look at the way modernist murals speak out and are not decorous and quiet in their environs. Cassatt's style of painting, we could say, acted out her feminism and her modernism even more radically than the wonderful iconography she invented. She spoke out without inhibition, and peers simply found her unorthodox, too unorthodox for their taste. Her modernity, in other words, was not just what she said, but how she said it. She dared to speak her mind. Thank you.